Hello, hello. All right, this is on. Hello. Yeah, so for some reason, they've chosen me to finish off this part of this event. I'm not a developer, I'm not an artist, I'm not an engineer, I'm a gamer, I'm a journalist, I'm a critic, so I guess that probably makes me more or less like a lot of people in the audience. So you're not going to get like a technical breakdown of the future from me, because I would leave that to more qualified people, I suppose. But I don't think that the future needs to be about... Yeah, that's me, sorry. The future doesn't need to be about, engineering or horsepower. It could just be about ideas, good ideas, used in new and interesting ways. Now, so I write for a site, GameIndustry.biz, which you may or may not have heard of. You've probably more likely heard of our sister site, Eurogamer. We're run by the same company. Eurogamer is for gamers, right? Like, they make Let's Play videos, they've got a YouTube channel, they've got all that stuff. The reason why you haven't heard of us, if you haven't heard of us, is the fact that we really write for developers, like the people making the games. The people really trying to come up with new experiences, things to kind of open your eyes, the people building the future. As a result of that, I obviously spend quite a lot of time thinking about the future and talking about the future with those people. Now, I've been a gamer all my life, and I know that as a gamer, you tend to think about the future in the near term, right? So maybe you're thinking, like, do you buy Battlefront, which you probably should. Is Fallout 4 going to be the best game of the year? Which it probably is, frankly. But when you have to consider the longer-term future, sometimes you have to look back, you have to look around you, and it can be very, very difficult to see what's coming. So the reason why I got into this in the first place, for some reason that's happened twice, I used to write for this magazine, Games TM. Again, some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have done. We're sort of like a slightly crapper version of a magazine called Edge, which is a lot more famous than we were. But nevertheless, we thought we were rather good, and we took games very seriously. And so when I arrived, I think maybe we'd given out 5 or 6 10 out of 10s in like 6 or 7 years as a magazine. So it's kind of a big deal. And one of the ways you would decide if it was a 10 out of 10 is the potential for this game to influence the future direction of games. So there will always be lots of discussions. I gave out 4 10 out of 10s on my time in the magazine. And because I knew I had to come and do this talk, I had to remind myself of what it was I thought the future would look like back in the day. And so it looks like these 4 games. Some of you probably don't agree with at least one of these. Probably the first one, Gears of War, the first 10 out of 10 I gave. BioShock, GTA 4, Mass Effect 2. I mean, obviously I didn't review all of the big games. Like, I would have given Fallout 3 a 10, I reckon, or Uncharted 2 maybe. But these are the ones that I gave. Now, the thing is, I regretted that Gears of War score almost immediately, because I know I was just new and I was kind of rash, and I just felt like giving a game a 10 out of 10, I suppose. But the thing is, like, looking back now, I can see that Gears of War could actually be the most influential game there in terms of what followed. And if you played games as I did throughout Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, you would know that it's really hard to think of an action game that wasn't influenced by Gears of War's cover mechanics, its action, the feel of the characters, the way the camera worked. I mean, it felt a little derivative at the time, but it actually went on to become like more influential, I would argue, than GTA 4 did, or Mass Effect 2 even. But basically the point is, the future can actually be pretty hard to predict, at least in terms of looking around at 1 or 2 games and seeing what's coming next. So thinking about this, the temptation is to go for larger trends. Now, you've probably heard about them already. Virtual reality is the future. I mean, for me, this is a no-brainer. Like, virtual reality, I've been writing about it for 3 years. You've been hearing about it for 3 years already. Virtual reality is kind of the present. It's not actually just the future. I mean, within 6 months, you'll be able to buy all of these headsets. Samsung Gear VR is already out there. I mean, it doesn't take much to say that VR is going to continue to be something big in the games industry. Second, esports, Twitch, streaming. I mean, these things, they're going to play a role in the future of games. But they're already a billion-dollar industry. Like, it's not the future so much as it is the present. free-to-play. Now, I kind of wish I didn't have to confirm that this is going to be the future of games, but needless to say it is. This is where all of the money in the industry is coming from at the moment. There's free-to-play microtransactions in Halo, in Assassin's Creed. If you play Payday 2, you'll probably be aware of the fact that Overkill and Starbreeze have just shoehorned in some microtransactions there. This is already the present, is going to be coming along from here, and it's probably going to get worse and worse and worse. However, as I say, all of these things are the present, and it doesn't take, a specialist to tell you that these things are going to continue being a big deal. What I'd like to do is use my own personal experience, my own personal taste, to give you a perspective maybe you haven't considered, and one that I hope can actually sort of inform the way that you think about how the role you can play in what the future of games can possibly be. To do that, though, I'm going to have to talk, strangely enough, about movies. Now, not in the way that you would typically think you talk about movies in relation to games. For a long time, I've been playing games since about 1985, because I'm pretty old at this point. And for a long time, developers just seem to want to make their games more and more like movies. And to do this, they put in really, really long cutscenes. They'd strip out interaction, quick time events. These are two pretty obvious examples of what I'm talking about. Heavy Rain in 2010, press X to forgive, press X to hug, press X to make scrambled eggs, press X to call out to your son. Like, it became like a bit of a meme online. I don't know if anyone remembers press X to Jason, but it took it to an almost absurd degree. Metal Gear Solid 4, a game I really like, but Metal Gear Solid 4 ends on a 71-minute cutscene. And in total, there's 5 hours where you're just sitting, watching stuff happen. So this is a way that games and films really aren't a useful way of looking at the future. This is kind of what the past is like. I don't think we're really going to be going back to that. What we really need to do, though, is go back to actual movies. So before I became a games journalist, I studied movies at university, film studies, screenwriting. Before I became a games journalist, I did a bit of work as a scriptwriter and as a film critic. And I started as a games journalist in 2005. And what became immediately apparent is that the moment that the industry was in right then had an awful lot in common with the moment that Hollywood was in back in what people call the golden age, which is sort of between the late 20s and the early 50s. People call it the golden age because more movies were made than ever before. There were more people going, and just generally it was like a vibrant and thriving industry, much like the games industry was back in 2005. But to create that, it was kind of run to what they called the studio system. Like, almost everything you saw would have been created by a relatively small number of very, very big companies. You'll recognize a lot of the names from today. 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, Universal. Like, these were the people that controlled all of the product. And they made it on a production line, right? So they reused sets and costumes, any way to cut corners just so they could get more and more and more product out. Now this, to me, I'll ask you to try and draw parallels in your own mind between the way the games industry works now. I think you could probably imagine what the sort of companies I'm talking about when I talk about these big film companies in relation to games. So, as a result of that reusing process, MGM made musicals, Universal made horror movies. You had the gangster movie studio, you had the Western movie studio. And as a result of this, directors and actors and creative talent, they were kind of controlled by the studios. They were owned by the studios. It's why John Wayne was always a cowboy. It's why James Cagney was always a gangster. They didn't get to choose what they did. Moreover, directors, who we now kind of see as the artist or the architect of a film, the guy that leads the production and gives it their vision, they were seen as no different from a sound guy or a lighting guy. They were just a technician. They just had to be there like a safe pair of hands. That was the way it went for an awful long time. Today we think of film as an art form. Back then, nobody thought film was an art form. No one was being taught about films in universities. No one was writing about films in that way. I mean, again, similar to the way we were talking about games in 2005, people just saw them as entertainment, and every time you tried to talk about them as anything else, you would kind of get shouted down, the media would turn on you, things like that. This all changed in the 50s, though, with a bunch of French film critics who worked for this magazine, Cahiers du Cinéma, right? This guy, André Bazin. Now, this was a very influential period of time for the way that the film would go in terms of becoming and flourishing as a mature artistic medium. These guys, they loved movies, but they saw that the directors and the actors working within Hollywood really didn't have the ability to express themselves creatively. These huge companies were controlling them. They didn't have the outlet to express themselves through the medium. So what they decided to do was, rather than just writing about them, because obviously they were critics, they decided to make films of their own, to express what their ideas were about how this medium should develop. So some examples of that. This movie, The 400 Blows, it was kind of like a take on, nothing had ever really existed like it before. It was a film about young people, something Hollywood didn't really ever do, but they were young people as kind of we are young people. They smoked, they swore, they fought each other, they talked about girls. Nothing much really happened. I mean, it's a brilliant film, but it was kind of, no one had ever seen anything like this before. It was released in North America to great acclaim, massive success. People kind of really responded to this new way of thinking about what films could be. Another example is this, Abu Dassouf, which could be translated as Breathless. This one is a real iconoclastic film. I mean, it took every rule that Hollywood had developed over decades and decades of working this factory line, and it turned them all on its head. It's kind of difficult to summarize without seeing it, but it broke editing conventions, the way it uses music. It has nudity and sex and random violence, and the main character is kind of a bastard, and he doesn't really learn anything in the end. But again, no one had seen anything like this. It was made for almost no money, and it came out and it caused a big stir. Now, there's a reason why. I mean, I could list more films here, but you kind of get the idea. It's like a wave of movies that were really looking at Hollywood, the way it had become, and kind of testing the limits of that and putting new ideas into the mix. Now, the reason why this was possible brings us back to the games industry. And the reason why this was possible is technology. So the 50s was the first time that a camera that could be held in your hand was available, where cheap lights that were good enough to shoot a movie were available. The same with sound equipment. So whereas before you needed a studio, you needed all the equipment, you needed all the people, you could now just get 3 or 4 people together, head out into the street and shoot a movie. Now, this was completely revolutionary in terms of what films had to be to actually be released and be in the public eye. Now, this is extremely important because this is the moment that we are at now, I believe. The games industry has always had its own studio system, represented by companies like this. Now, until about, 2007, 2008, with the release of games like World of Goo and Braid, and the launch of digital platforms, they controlled pretty much everything you were seeing. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the games that these companies made, but you would get the same genres over and over again, the same treatment of the same subject matter. There's more to come. And we're doing that now with new technology. You'll probably be familiar with almost all of this, I would say. But everyone's got a smartphone in their pocket. That's a gaming device. Apple and Google, they kind of proliferated gaming devices across the world, made it a mass market medium in a way it never had before. More importantly, they allowed cheap development tools to enter the market. A marketplace to sell your products that wasn't like the old retail stores where you had to fight for shelf space, which limited the amount of games that anyone could even know about. Here you have a completely democratic environment for games. Steam did a similar thing on a smaller scale for the PC, really opened it up, organized it better. And you have tools like Unity and Game Maker and even Twine, which is quite basic. But most of these tools are free or available at a relatively small cost compared to the way, say, the Unreal Engine used to monetize itself. I mean, that would cost a lot of money. The licensing fees for consoles used to be much, much higher. it kind of sparked a whole new way of thinking about development, and the big companies have responded in part to the influx of developers. I'm sure the popularity of an event like this, the reason why you're listening to me drivel on about this, is probably entirely motivated by the availability of these products and the fact that you feel like you can do something now, that you can be a developer too. This is what happened with movies back in the 1950s. This is what revolutionized the film industry. So, I have some examples of games that I think are particularly telling as examples of what is now being done, and I think these are some of the most interesting and original ideas that have ever come out of games. So, okay. This is the Stanley.
This is the story of a man named Stanley. Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard. Orders came to him through a monitor on his desk, telling him what buttons to push, how long to push them, and in what order. This is what employee 427 did every day of every month of every year. And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job. And Stanley was happy. And then one day, something very peculiar happened. Something that would forever change Stanley. Something he would never quite forget. He had been at his desk for nearly an hour when he realized that not one single order had arrived on the monitor for him to follow. No one had showed up to give him instructions, call a meeting, or even say hi. Never in all his years at the company had this happened, this complete isolation. Something was very clearly wrong. Shocked, frozen solid, Stanley found himself unable to move for the longest time. But as he came to his wits and regained his senses, he got up from his desk and stepped out of his office.
So at this point, the game gives you control of the character, Stanley. Now, it takes a little while to get to a kind of a more interesting point, as is often the way with gameplay videos on YouTube, but it's made by a guy called Davey Redden, who pretty much was using a similar approach to what the French New Wave guys were doing, particularly that film Breathless I talked about. He saw all of these conventions, the things we just unthinkingly do in video games, and he thought he would make a game based on the idea purely of breaking those conventions and turning them on their head. Now, I'll just skip forward to a slight bit later to get you a better illustration of what the game is actually trying to do.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
Okay. So, we could watch that for a lot longer, but you get the idea, right? He sees 2 doors, he turned left. The guy turns right. Now this game, every choice you're supposed to make is sort of narrated by this voice. You can choose to do it, you can choose not to do it. I think it can end in one of about 25 different ways. It's a really fascinating game. It's available for very cheap. You should definitely check it out. But this kind of illustrates the point I'm making about what this new technology, what this accessibility has allowed people to start doing. Now, another example of a game. Whoop. Let's do that. It's not a small dinosaur. Okay, so the internet, as is often the case with the internet, isn't playing ball. So this game is Gone Home. I'm sure you've all heard of it, or you may have heard of it anyway. If not, that video would have done the trick of introducing it, but I'll have to do it for you. Made by a company called Fulbright Company. It was a group of 3 developers who were working on BioShock at 2K Marin. They'd all become very good at making environments and objects, but they're all getting a bit frustrated that every time they had to make these objects and these environments, They were really only ever being used as backdrops for lots of shooting and explosions and stuff like that. I mean, I speak as someone for whom BioShock is one of the great games of all time. I really love these games. But these guys just have been in that system, and they were getting tired of always being told, this is how you express yourself. So they left, and they put those exact same skills to the test in a new environment. Now, Gone Home is all set in one house, and it's much the same as you might do exploring a house in Skyrim or Fallout 3. You walk around, you pick things up, you examine them, you read letters, you listen to audio tapes and things like that, and you kind of create a story for yourself. Throughout the game, a storm is kind of raging outside, and it really kind of feels like at any minute, a monster or a demon might jump out, you might be handed a shotgun and have to take everything out. This is what they want you to think. Because what they're doing is using all those expectations built up that the games industry has given you and telling a much smaller, more simple story about a young girl realizing something quite important about herself. Now, it's worth playing it. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But suffice to say, it isn't the sort of story we ever really see in games. And Gone Home got huge praise. It got huge sales. As a result of this, there is an audience for this stuff. Now, as I said, the Stanley Parable reminds me of Breathless. This film reminds me of the 400 Blows in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. Now, so that is kind of the state of play, but I think it tells us a lot about what might be coming next. Because if you look back at what followed those filmmakers in the 50s, what it did to Hollywood, and by Hollywood we're talking about the AAA industry, the stuff we all get the most excited about, it completely changed the way other filmmakers were thinking about what they were doing and what the studios thought they could sell. This is extremely important. So here we've got work from Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola. This is some of the best work Hollywood ever produced, some of my favorite movies of all time. Daring and new and original, and I'm sure you're aware of some of these movies, if not these ones, then other movies by the same directors. But this is kind of Spielberg. These are like the real guys that you love right now, that you love today. And it was all because they kind of grew up watching, or were educated watching, the French New Wave stuff. So this is where I think we're at now. I think that we're going to get a new wave of game developers who are educating themselves with stuff like the Stanley Parable, with stuff like Gone Home, and the list goes on and on. Cart Life, which is an extremely interesting game about the day-to-day life of an extremely poor man who has to run a hot dog cart in New York City. It's kind of deliberately made to be a little bit boring, but in that it kind of finds some sort of, weird form of entertainment. Papers, Please is another example of this. A game about being a border guard in a fictional country, and the choices you have to make. It's sort of designed to not be fun, which is exactly what games have always been designed to do. So this is kind of the point I'm making here, is that these are the ideas that will lead to the future of the games industry. These are the ideas that will kind of take us beyond Call of Duty 12, which I would love to play, but we've had 12 of them already, right? Like, it's time for something new. I believe in 10 years, we'll look back at this moment and we'll see that this is what created a new future for games. We're already seeing it a little bit in games like The Last of Us, stuff like Life is Strange or The Walking Dead, kind of games playing with those ideas that we've grown up with, that we've all been nourished on all these years, trying to make us feel and think different things. So Jean-Luc Godard, the guy that directed Breathless, he has a famous quote where he said, "All you need for a movie is a girl and a gun." These days, all you need to make a game is a laptop and a copy of a Unity license. So I would urge you to get started, because the future of games, really, you can have a huge impact on that. Thanks very much for your time. Hope it made some sense. All right. Cool.